Hey guys, welcome back. It looks quite a bit different out here compared to the last time we shot a video. Now, there was a gunshot right there, but we got a lot of snow in the past week. And that's because we're into December now. We're into the final stretch of the hunting season. And that's what I want to talk about in today's video, strategies for hunting during the late part of the season. And when I say hunting the later part of the season or late season hunting, I'm basically going to be referring to the month of December. So after the pre-rut, after the primary rut, kind of into that post-rut, secondary rut recovery time frame. And just like we do in a lot of our videos, in order to figure out what our hunting strategies are going to be during the late part of the season, we really need to figure out what the deer are doing during this time of the year. And this time of year, throughout the month of December and into January, if your state allows hunting throughout January, the deer are really starting to shift into survival mode. And this shift is taking place for a few reasons. One, the habitat is changing drastically. A lot of those food sources that were abundant in the early season and available throughout the fall, those have gone dormant, and sometimes they're under a foot of snow and sometimes ice. The cover is also changing drastically. A lot of the leaves, or most of the leaves, are off the trees now. The vegetation is dying back. A lot of those grasses are now laying down under the snow. Areas that were once providing cover feel a lot more open. And the deer herd, they recognize these changes and they start to shift into survival mode. A lot of these deer, they've been through a winter before. They know what's coming. Most everything the deer herd does throughout the late season revolves around conserving energy, staying warm, staying alive, minimizing exposure, and rebuilding lost body weight. There goes another gunshot right there. But the temperatures are starting to drop, and so the deer need to do everything that they can to conserve energy. And a lot of days, especially those really cold ones, this translates to staying hunkered down within those bedding areas for a majority of the day. And that's going to lead us right into the first tip or the first strategy that I like to implement throughout most of the late part of the season. And it's actually one that we implement and focus on during the early part of the season. During the late season and also during the early part of the season, deer are getting back to those bedding areas early in the morning, so before first light. Another gunshot. So this means that if we are trying to hunt or push in close to these bedding areas in the morning, we have a really good chance of either bumping those deer along the way, or they might already be in those bedding areas. We have a good chance of spooking them as we get to our stand location. So throughout most of the late season, I generally don't focus much on morning hunts and instead focus on those afternoon or evening hunts. Again, this is because during the later part of the season, especially if it's really cold, these deer are getting back to those bedding areas early in the morning, and they're staying there. They're staying hunkered down throughout most of the day before they're getting up in their late afternoon, early evening to start heading towards those late season food sources. But just because we're not hunting a lot of mornings or we're not pushing in close to those bedding areas, we still want to know where are these deer bedding down throughout the later part of the season. And to figure that out, we can kind of go back to what we talked about earlier with what are the deer doing this time of year. They're trying to survive. They're shifting into survival mode, and they're trying to conserve energy. And the bedding areas that the deer are gravitating towards throughout the later part of the season can be explained with one core reason: survival. Now, they are selecting each of these different bedding areas for different reasons, but the main reoccurring theme is survival. And we're going to touch on 4 late season bedding areas in this video that hopefully you guys can find on your property or close to it. And the first one that we're going to touch on is one that's well known, and that's thermal cover. This could be a cedar thicket, this could be a spruce plantation, this could be a cluster of white pines. The deer herd gravitates towards these pockets of conifers for a few different reasons. One is within these pockets, the temperature is a few degrees warmer than the surrounding area. And we might not think that that's a big deal or that's like a lot, but to a deer herd that's trying to survive, that's trying to conserve as much energy as possible, a few degrees makes a huge difference. Another reason the deer herd likes to bed down within those conifer stands, within that thermal cover, is because those pine trees, those spruces, they hold their needles all year long. Unlike the oaks and maples, they lose their leaves, but those pines, those conifers, they hold their needles, which then block snow, block wind. So when those deer are within those stands, They're much more protected from the elements compared to bedding down in the open hardwoods. Moving on to the second late season bedding area that the deer herd gravitates towards this time of year, we're going to stick with the same theme of being protected from the elements, and that's the leeward side of a hill. So you have the windward side and the leeward side. The leeward side is just the non-windy side. So if you have the wind coming from the north, the leeward side is going to be the south side of the hill. Basically, that side of the hill is protected from the wind. But that doesn't mean it's always the south side of the hill. If the wind is coming from the south, the north side of the hill becomes the leeward side of the hill. During these cold winter months, that wind chill can be much colder than the actual temperature. And remember, these deer have shifted into survival mode. They're trying to conserve as much energy as possible to give them the best chance of making it through the winter. And on those really cold, windy days, the deer herd can move to the leeward side of the hill to help them conserve energy, which gives them a much better chance at survival. The third late season bedding area also has to do with survival, conserving energy, and also hillsides. But this one has less to do with harsh weather and more to do with the sun. And this is a solar bedding area or a south-facing slope. Not every day throughout the month of December or throughout the winter is a really harsh day. There are days where we have clear skies, the sun is out, there's not very much wind, and even though it might be 25 degrees, it feels comfortable outside because there is very little wind. We have clear skies, and we can feel that sun beating down on us, which helps bring up the body temperature. These days are great for the deer herd because they can sit on those south-facing slopes and just get warmed up by the sun. And if they're getting warmed up by the sun, that means that they don't have to burn as much energy to stay warm. And the more energy that they can conserve, that means the less that they have to consume to replace it. And the last late season bedding area that I want to touch on in this video also has to do with survival, but it's survival for a different reason. And that's a really thick, high stem count bedding area. You can hear another gunshot behind me. I think I've heard probably 15 of them since I've been recording this video. And that's basically the deer are shifting towards these high stem count bedding areas to get away from hunting pressure. Depending on when your state started its season, here in Michigan, our season starts on October 1st, the deer have been hunted pretty hard for at least 2 months and hunted very hard since the firearm opener. And here in Michigan, that's November 15. So the last 2 weeks, the deer here in Michigan have been hunted extremely hard. And the deer herd recognizes this pressure and they start to retreat to the nastiest cover that they can find, whether that's an autumn olive thicket, a bunch of multiflora rose, just a really thick, nasty tag alder swamp. They find the thickest stuff that they can find and they hide in it to escape the hunting pressure. Here in Michigan, on any given year, we have about 500,000 hunters going out during the firearm season. That's a lot of hunters in the woods pressuring the deer, pushing them into the nastiest cover available. But those are 4 different bedding areas that deer tend to gravitate towards during the later part of the season. And it's important to identify these late season bedding areas either on your property or around your property so that you can select the correct stand locations. You don't want to be hunting where the deer were in the early season or where the deer were bedded during November during the rut. You want to be focusing your hunts on where these deer are bedding down now. Because as we mentioned earlier, we don't hunt a whole lot of mornings in the later part of the season. We focus more on those afternoon or evening hunts when those deer are getting up out of those bedding areas and heading towards that food source. So we really want to be placing ourselves on the trail in between those bedding areas and the food sources. So the first step is to identify where are these deer bedding, and then the next step is where are these deer heading to? What is that late season food source? And that is the next tip or the next strategy that we focus on during the late season. And again, it's not hunting mornings, it's more focusing on that afternoon or evening food source, because during the later part of the season, bucks tend to get back on that bed to feed pattern, much like they were in that early part of the season. They just had a very busy month chasing, tending, breeding does, pushing off other bucks, getting pushed around by hunters, getting shot at or shot by hunters. If a buck, especially a Michigan buck, is lucky enough to make it to December, they're going to be extremely worn out. Bucks can lose up to 25% of their weight during the rut. So again, now during the later part of the season, they start to shift back towards those feeding patterns to build up those fat reserves to help them survive the winter. And there are several great late season food sources that hopefully you guys either have on your property or close to it. One would be cereal rye. Two, if you guys have a brassica blend planted on your property, if you guys have standing soybeans either on or around your property, or maybe standing corn on or around your property, these are all great late season food sources. Really, any high carb, high energy crop is a great late season food source, and one that I'd be focusing on this time of year, again, as deer, especially those bucks, are trying to replenish those fat reserves to get through the winter. That being said, the location of the late season food source, or the proximity of that food compared to where the bedding is, does matter. If you have a late season food source that's 400 yards away, 800 yards away from the late season bedding, there's a good chance that those deer are not going to get up out of that late season bedding area to travel to that late season food source. Remember, these deer have been heavily pressured for 2 months, especially really hard the last 2 weeks. So they do not want to expose themselves to that pressure. They're most likely going to be bedded down until dark and then get up and then move to that food source if it's further away. If you happen to have a late season food source that's relatively close to a late season bedding area, that's when you're going to have a lot more daylight activity, as these deer feel a lot more comfortable moving that shorter distance from the late season bedding to the late season food. At least that's been my experience here in Michigan, where we have a very pressured deer herd. During the later part of the season, the deer still move from those bedding areas to those food sources, but their daylight movement tends to be a lot shorter, again, because they've been pressured for 2 months and very pressured for the last 2 weeks. So try to find a late season bedding area that's relatively close to a late season food source. So if you have like a stand of white pine, some thermal cover that's right next to a brassica food plot, that would be a killer location during the late season. And the last tip or strategy that I want to touch on in today's video for hunting during the later part of the season is a fun one, especially for those of you guys that still have a buck tag, and that's hunting the second rut, or hunting the second flurry or spike in breeding that takes place in the month of December. It doesn't matter what we call it, but you do need to understand that there is a second round of breeding that takes place in the month of December. Depending on how many deer you have in your area, the buck to doe ratio, meaning if you have, let's say, a lot of deer, but your buck to doe ratio is out of whack, so you have a lot of does, not a lot of bucks, there's a good chance that not all of those does are going to be bred during that first round of breeding, during the primary rut. And any doe that was not bred during the primary rut is going to come into a second estrus cycle about 28 days later. Around the same time, the doe fawns in your area are going to come into their first estrus cycle as long as they have hit the appropriate body weight. And the bucks in your neighborhood, they know this. They know that those does are going to be coming into estrus, and they're going to be looking for them just like they were during the primary rut. And again, the amount of does that are going to come into heat in your area or on your property is going to vary, year to year, and it's going to vary area to area. So if you have a lot of does, not a lot of bucks, there's a good chance you're going to have more does coming into their second cycle because they weren't bred the first time around. But if you don't have a lot of deer in your area and you have more of a balanced buck to doe ratio, then there's a good chance most of those does are going to be bred during the primary rut, but you're still going to experience the second rut or that second spike in breeding because the doe fawns are still going to come into their first cycle. So even if all your does were bred during the primary rut, you're still going to have those doe fawns come into estrus. You're still going to experience that second spike in breeding in early December. And on the properties that we hunt here in Michigan, we hunt in mid-Michigan, I would say the second rut or that second spike in breeding is generally taking place around the 5th of December, and it goes on for about a week before it dies back down. So it's not as crazy. It doesn't go on as long as that primary rut, but it still goes on for about a week, starting around December 5. Some years a little bit earlier, some years a little bit later, but it generally starts around December 5 on our properties in mid-Michigan. And how we're approaching the second rut really doesn't differ much from how we're approaching the primary rut. We are really focusing on these doe family groups and where are they bedding and where are they going to feed, because where these doe family groups are, that's where those bucks are going to be searching. I mentioned this a couple times already, but during the later part of the season, we are generally focusing more on those afternoon sits or those evening hunts as those deer are getting up out of those bedding areas and heading towards the food sources. But if we are going to take a chance at a morning hunt during the later part of the season, it's going to be during the second rut, during that second spike in breeding in December. So we'll try to place ourselves on some sort of a pinch point in between two of those known late season bedding areas. Or again, during the afternoon, try to place yourself on that trail that's in between that late season bedding area and that late season food source. So hopefully what we're doing during the later part of the season makes sense. There's a lot of similarities to other parts of the season. A lot of it is kind of shifting back to that bed to feed pattern from the early part of the season. And there's also a little bit of rut hunting strategy with that second spike in breeding in December. The biggest difference with December is trying to focus on where these deer are now, where they are during the later part of the season, because it is a lot different. They're focusing on different bedding areas now, different food sources. So you gotta try to isolate those first, figure out what the deer are doing now, and then you can hunt them. But that's going to do it for today's video, guys, and a few tips, a few strategies for hunting during the later part of the season. If you guys have any other tips or strategies for hunting during the late season that you guys like to focus on, I'd love to hear them. I'm sure everyone else would as well. Drop those in the comment section below, and we will see you guys in the next video.